Hi, everybody. My name is Charlie Spillane. I'm the chair of the Irish Forum for International Agricultural Development. I'd like to welcome you all to our event today, our webinar learning event. It's a knowledge and learning event of our forum. For those of you who are not familiar with the Irish Forum for International Agricultural Development, we were founded in 2016 to bring together all the kind of key stakeholders in Ireland that are engaged in international agricultural development. I'm the chair. Patrice is the coordinator of IFIAD, working full-time, funded by Irish Aid. And we also have a committee that oversees the activities of the forum. One of our kind of key goals is to promote engagement and knowledge and learning between the different stakeholders who are involved in international agricultural development in Ireland. And this event is, one of the type of events that we've been doing over the years and continue to do. So today's event is called Can Voluntary Carbon Markets Deliver Fairer Outcomes for Smallholder Farmers? It really arose because some of our members, the NGOs, development organizations, universities, and indeed the ministries, there's a discussion underway as to how can voluntary carbon markets deliver fairer outcomes for smallholder farmers in rural communities, particularly in Africa. And we wanted to set up this initial webinar really as a kind of learning piece between not only our speakers, who I'm very thankful to for dedicating the time to give an overview of the topic and their experiences, but also we want to hear a lot from the audience. And we realize there's a lot of people, we have 29 people online at the moment, and there are people online that would have viewpoints, would have experiences and etc. in relation to voluntary carbon markets that we'd like to hear from. So please, if everybody would engage, that would be great. Okay. Our speakers today, we have a presentation from One Acre Fund, and then we have the perspectives of VITA, Eden, People and Planet, and also Self-Help Africa. And after each one of those, we'll have a question and answers session, and at the end, then we'll invite perspectives and comments from the audience, or indeed any other further questions. So that's the kind of our run of show for today. I was asked in terms of presenting this, that really to explain firstly what are voluntary carbon credits, because maybe not everybody has an understanding of what they are. So really, these are really mechanisms by which companies, any types of organizations, or indeed individuals, can purchase credits for the reduction or removal of greenhouse gas emissions that might occur elsewhere, and that would offset part of their own emissions, either fully or partly. And those credits can be generated by projects that lead to reduction in emissions or avoidance of emissions, or indeed carbon dioxide removal. They're critical. These voluntary carbon credits are an important mechanism. They're being pursued amongst other mechanisms to try to contribute to our efforts to stay within 1.5 or 2 degrees warming by end of century, in line with the Paris Agreement and the UNFCCC. And if for those of you interested in the policy space on this, the key article in the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change is Article 6, which focuses on international cooperation in carbon markets. So voluntary carbon markets and trading is really important to bring private finance into the mix for emissions reductions that might not occur through existing regulations or incentives. It's clear that to get to 1.5 or 2 degrees warming or stay within that by end of century, there's really need for drastic emissions cuts by 2030, by 2050, to get to net zero, ideally by 2050, but also to bring into play also possibly carbon dioxide removal initiatives, things like bioenergy with carbon capture and storage, or direct air capture and storage systems. So there's quite a lot of massive scale of activity required to stay within 1.5 degree by end of century. And if you're interested in that, the 1.5 degree report from the IPCC is a sobering read. So in the agriculture space, we're all in the agriculture and food system space. What types of activities might be covered by voluntary carbon credits? We've got activities around soil carbon sequestration, livestock and manure management, crop and fertilizer management, land use change and avoided emissions, and then nature-based and agroecological systems, and also possibly avoiding food losses and waste, and also renewable energy systems. But then there's a lot of policy, technical, and indeed equity questions under discussion around the voluntary carbon credits that I think we'd hope would get to discuss really in this webinar today. things like how to leverage co-benefits, for instance, on biodiversity, how to use these voluntary carbon credits in difficult to abate sectors like agriculture, and then there's a range of other kind of practical questions, I suppose, around additionality and baseline problems. So if an activity would have happened anyways, carbon credits should not be issued. Then questions around the permanence of the carbon sequestered. How long does the carbon stay sequestered? How fixed is it? What happens if there's a fire in a forest and the carbon is released again? And this kind of relates to monitoring, measurement, reporting, and verification systems. There's also this issue of leakage, that if you prevent emissions in one location, does it drive emissions in another location? And then it would reduce the benefits. And questions around counting. So if a company or an organization gets carbon credits, then those carbon credits cannot be double counted, let's say for a government in its NDC. So there's a range of topics, and there are probably others as well. And there are standards and methodologies emerging that I think the speakers today will speak to. But nonetheless, the voluntary carbon market is a powerful tool to deliver investment and sustainable development. And then there are questions as to how best to do that for the benefit of smallholders and rural communities in Africa. So really, today's is to get an introduction, and later we'll hear from some of the NGOs that are working on the credits. So at that, I'm going to stop my introduction. I was asked to kind of give a small introduction. But how we're going to proceed here is that we'll keep the audio off of everybody. If you have questions or comments, you can, while the speakers are talking, you can put them in the chat box, and I'll act to chair and relay those to the speakers. Okay, so please put any comments that you have or questions. At that, I'm going to start by, we have speakers from 1Acre, from Eden, from VITA, and also from Self-Help Africa. So I'm going to start with John Mundy, who's going to give us a presentation. John is the Director of Global Partnerships at the 1Acre Fund. He leads the partnerships globally, and he was previously Strategy Director for the World Food Programme's Farm to Market Alliance and founding director of the Digital Climate Smart Agriculture Practice from Mercy Corps Agri-Finance. He's a board advisor of Producers Direct. And 1Acre, we reached out to 1Acre, Patrice and I, because really we found that 1Acre is very much focused on kind of last mile delivery of benefits to smallholders. And 1Acre's 2030 goal is quite ambitious. It's to deliver $1 billion in impact per year to 10 million farming households and cumulatively plant 1 billion trees. So at that, I'm going to hand over to John. And then if people have questions for John during his talk, or indeed after it, if you put them in the chat, then I'll relay those to John at the end, and then we'll move on to the next speaker after that. So over to you, John, and very welcome.
Thanks so much, Charles. Just to confirm, you can see my screen?
Yeah, all good.
Great. Well, thank you so much for that introduction. It saves me having to introduce myself. And so I only have 10 minutes for the presentation. So you'll see me skipping through various slides. And of course, very open to answering any questions you have. So my presentation today is really about how we're looking at tying carbon credits to intensive agroforestry. So I think the first macro level remark I have about the carbon markets is that no one carbon unit is created equally, and so if you look at different carbon credit types, nature-based solutions, etc., as Charles laid out, my big caveat here is that this is not going to be a solid assessment of the value of carbon markets for smallholder farmers. It's going to be looking at how we look at intensive agroforestry systems and how we then pay for those through carbon credit markets, which is an important lever for us. I think there are many valid critiques of carbon markets that we can get into, but that would be very much my kind of personal opinion. Anyway, so just to introduce 1Acre Fund very quickly. We are a nonprofit 501c3 in the US with 10 different country programs. We're a nonprofit social enterprise. So some of what we do is provide financing and life improving technology, so seed, solar products, other types of products to farmers to help them increase their income every season. And on average, we increase farmer impact by 40%. And we aim to do that efficiently. So for every dollar invested in our program, we're aiming for $5 of farmer profits returned. In 2006, we were 40 farmers in Western Kenya and Rwanda, and now we're 5.5 million clients who choose to enroll with us every year. and we're aiming for 10 million clients by 2030. Our core model is really what we call a market bundle of services. So we support farmers through a network of 8,000 field officers in those 10 countries by providing access to affordable finance for inputs in kind, delivered close to where farmers live, and then delivered alongside training and market facilitation. That's what we've been doing for a long time with staple food crops like maize. But over the years, we've started to expand into other realms like agroforestry, which we'll talk about today. But we also do quite a lot of work on retail logistics, government extension services, and increasingly we're looking at commercially relevant, climate smart agroforestry crops for export and some other areas to improve the diversification for smallholder farmers. On top of that, our climate strategy, very briefly, is to help improve farmers' plant health, soil health, income diversification, and safety nets. And within that, agroforestry is actually a big part of at least three of these pillars, because we know agroforestry systems increase farmers' soil health. We also see trees as a way of providing a safety net for farmers in financial crisis and shock. And with carbon markets and fruit trees, we're able to deliver more pathways to income diversification. I might skip over this slide, but we measure our results based on control farmers. That's the same with our agroforestry and carbon program. So everything we do is rigorously measured through representative samples. And on average, we see a 36 to 40% increase in profits compared to control farmers that we measure every year. Anyway, on to the good stuff, which is more about the agroforestry program. So we started agroforestry about 10 years ago. And this was a pilot to see what would the farmer benefits be in distributing free trees to farmers in the field through decentralized farmer-owned and operated nurseries. And over the last 10 years, we've seen huge increase in popularity of this program and expansion across our country programs. We distribute over 100 million trees a year. And part of this kind of popularity and scale is due to the returns that trees provide, both in terms of environmental co-benefits, but also in terms of a livelihood asset. And many farmers are using those trees on farm for timber and fuelwood as well, which we can talk about as it relates to carbon markets. This is what I call our kind of core tree distributing work. And this isn't actually the carbon programs we're talking about today, just to be clear. But one of the reasons we started working on carbon 4 years ago was to see how could we find a sustainable way of financing trees for farmers long term. And one of the things we found, and one of the reasons we've scaled our tree programs so quickly and they're now so expensive, is that the social return on investment from tree programs compared to our other operations, so our kind of core agricultural work, trees return about $10 for every dollar spent compared to $4 of impact for every dollar spent in our agricultural programs, or $5 this year. So we operate a large network of over 5,000 decentralized farmer-owned nurseries. And this is kind of a inbuilt logistical network for tree distribution that we're also relying on for our carbon program, and is highly replicable. So I'm just going to pivot quickly. I'm sorry I'm talking so fast, but I want to get to some of the meat and bones of the carbon market. And I think it's important to hear our context. So for the intensive agroforestry work, we've developed over the last 4 years a 4-country pilots, and they're in Tanzania, Rwanda, Malawi, and Zambia. We started in Zambia and Tanzania in 2021 in partnership with the Nature Conservancy and with a series of other partners. Terra Carbon is our main kind of advisor. And we looked at how could we develop country pilots that support farmers' intensive agroforestry needs on farm. So what that means is our goal was really to create a system where we could massively increase the amount of trees planted in between crops to improve soil health. And then how could we finance that with carbon? And I won't dwell on each country's pilot for now, but can take questions if you have any. And one of the most important thing for us is that the tree packages in each country context are adapted to those agroecological conditions and farmers' free, prior, and informed consent. And this is a kind of a cornerstone of the carbon markets, if you're working with smallholder farmers and communities in the global south especially, is we developed, one of the reasons we've taken 4 years to develop these pilots is it's in deep consultation with farmers and the communities that we work with. And then the tree packages themselves have taken a long time to design. Zambia's Miombo agroecological context is very different from Rwanda's upland tropical conditions in Western Rwanda that we also serve. So actually, we've taken a long time to try and tailor packages for each country context and each regional context within those countries. What we found over the last 4 or 5 years through this program, though, is interestingly, and Charles mentioned this, is that we're seeing probably equal amounts of potential impact from intensive agroforestry co-benefits as we are seeing from potential carbon revenue. And what this means is we have a baseline, a minimum of 60% of all carbon revenue has to go back to farmers. So including carbon revenue in dark green, you see that the kind of cumulative total impact for farmers is about 50% coming from direct carbon payments and about 50% from soil health improvement, yield improvement, climate resilience, etc. And I think this is based on our field data, but I think it shows that we're leaving a lot of value on the table by not valuing co-benefits even more than we are currently in the carbon markets. So just quickly, I've kind of spoken theoretically, but very basically, how does an intensive agroforestry system with carbon markets work? Well, in Zambia, what we're doing is alley cropping a tree species called Fidebia. It's an acacia derivative that is nitrogen fixing. And we work with farmers to plant around 300 trees per hectare. Not all of those trees survive. So overall, about 400 trees in 2 years are surviving. And then we pay farmers in the first 3 or 4 years for those surviving trees on farm. We pay them what we call survival incentive payments for the trees. And then from year 4 or 5, when carbon revenue should become significant because the trees are mature enough to sequester above a ton a hectare, we start paying, hopefully, from the carbon markets. Now, this is the first year where we're starting to hit that threshold. So I can't tell you how well that's going to work yet, but I can certainly assure you that's our goal. This is a very expensive program, though, because a lot of the costs that we're incurring are upfront. We geotag the farms, we do the field boundaries, we use the survival incentive payments we do out of pocket, etc. I have quite a few more slides. I have a couple minutes left, so I'm going to kind of try and see what's most relevant. I think for those of you who are kind of technical in the sector, we're doing quite a lot of work on monitoring, reporting, and verification. The headline here is it's way harder than we thought 4 or 5 years ago to do monitoring, reporting, verification well. And also the science in our sector in Africa for identifying tree species in early years, for example, or some other areas of identification of above ground biomass for carbon, the technology is still not quite there yet. So anyone who says in the carbon markets that MRV through tech and not through field operations, they're blowing carbon smoke up you know what. But I would say that we are seeing some advancements in this area. It's just extremely expensive, so it's not necessarily going to make it cheaper to do. One of my big takeaways. Maybe I'll end. I have a longer deck that maybe Patrice could share, but I think what we're seeing in some of the farmer testimonies in Zambia, especially in the last few years that's had a 100-year record drought, is that farmers who we've worked with and who other NGOs have worked with, so Conservation Farming Unit, etc., who have had mature Fidebia trees, not necessarily through One Acre Fund, but what they saw through this tree planting mechanism is a much bigger increase in climate resilience. So Passmore, who I've met personally, he's seen he lost a lot less than most maize farmers lost during droughts because of the soil moisture retention potential of these trees, and that's really why we're doing the work on carbon markets. If I found an easier way to fund agroforestry systems which provide these benefits to Passmore and have such an intensive program of tree planting, I would. But the reality at the moment is there is really no other funding source apart from philanthropy that can support such intensive tree planting outside of carbon. And that's my kind of provocative statement for the group. And maybe I'll end there to respect time.
Thanks so much, John. And if it's okay with you, then if you could possibly share your slide deck, the extended one with everybody, if that's fine on the One Acre side too. That would
Sure,
be great, I think. Yeah.
no problem.
So like how we're operating is we have questions in the chat, and I'm just going to read those out to John, right? I think it's just in terms of organization. So Paul Wagstaff from South Africa, Paul has a question. Paul's question is, how much did land tenure systems influence your selection of pilot countries? Paul noticed that Ethiopia, land owned by the government, and Uganda, a complicated mix of land tenure systems, are not in the pilot. So, okay.
Yeah, absolutely. So voluntary carbon markets would mandate that you have to have land tenure. We have managed to find some flexibility on community governance in Zambia, for instance, where there are community-led rules around land tenure that the government acknowledges, and so we've had various waivers from the government there. So if you have either a country with strong land tenure, or you have governments who are flexible to community land tenure rules, we found that we can develop these pilots. As you suggest, in somewhere like Ethiopia, or actually Kenya, to be honest, has been very challenging as well on agroforestry systems because of a very decentralized approach to land tenure. We have avoided those countries' contexts for early year work. We might develop things in Uganda later, and certainly nothing's off the table. I think the key for us is that farmers have some form of tenure, and we are working with Landesa and others on developing land tenure systems in some countries where it's underdeveloped, but that's really long term and really expensive. And so for the carbon market works, we kind of had to work quicker than those systemic changes could happen.
Super, thanks, John. Then the next question is from James Walker. James is asking, when there is a promise of revenue to the farmers, how do you plan to manage expectations and relationships in years when there may be low or no revenue, for example, market crashes, low demand, etc.?
Yeah, such an important point. And this is, I don't think anyone could claim to be perfect on this, but because we're at the behest of market systems that aren't necessarily designed for smallholder farmer revenue streams. However, what we do is in the pilot stage, so before we've signed a contract with a carbon buyer, we sign an initial contract for 3 years with farmers, and we say we will commit to paying survival incentives for surviving trees in those first 3 years. That's from our own grant income. However, once that carbon contract happens or is very close to final, we go back to the farmers and then we start signing longer term contracts with them where the revenue streams are clearer. For us, we would never be able to do that without an advanced market commitment with a floor price from a carbon buyer that is above market prices and is at cost of what it costs to deliver the programs, which is much more expensive than the average, by the way, of market prices. However, basically, there are a couple of checks and balances we don't let farmers down. But I can't rule out the carbon market finding other ways to let them down, and that there's only so much you can do to protect them against that.
Super. Next question. I'm going to go through the questions you John. So if something's too complicated or don't answer, that's fine too. Don't worry. So Orla Kilcullen from Department of Foreign Affairs in Ireland has asked a question. In your first slide, you said the agroforestry was free for farmers, but you have a cost of $20. Could you clarify this point?
Yeah, that's what it costs us. But agroforestry, our 100 million trees a year we distribute, just to be clear, we distribute on average like 15 to 20 free trees per farmer per season. And we pay the farmer-owned nursery to distribute those to our clients. And so that's a very simple system. It's all donor-based. And that cost is we take the cost of the program, the cost of the tree, the cost of the operations, and that's how you get that $20. For the carbon programs, technically, some of the work is paid for by farmers, so they pay a deposit, a 10% deposit for the package of the trees. And then there's the 90% is actually financed by future carbon revenue, theoretically. So they are essentially given a very long-term, completely concessional, risk-free loan backed by future carbon revenue to be able to afford the 600 trees and the various costs therein. That's within the carbon revenue sharing agreement with farmers.
Super. We also have a question from, I'm not sure the full name, but Tam777. How do you, it's a bit of a long question, but I'll read it out. Okay, so how you can read it also. How do you calculate the beneficial benefit from the project since when the MRV can calculate the carbon reduction to generate eligible carbon credit for selling? How do you ensure that the methodology used by your MRV will be accepted by government of the piloting countries so farmers can benefit from the results coming from the MRV? And then do these countries have the legal system to establish the voluntary carbon markets or like guidelines for how individual farmers can sell and benefit from the carbon credit?
Yeah, so we do a bunch of forecasting based on our impact data and some third-party research on the co-benefits. So we measure yields every year through our own crop cuts of staple food crops. We also then, because some of the trees aren't mature enough to know if those yields are going to happen, we then bring in external research. And something like Fiderbia is a very long-standing conservation agriculture tree that many different groups have worked with for a long time. So that's slightly easier done. We also look at some of the income streams that can come from fruit trees, things like moringa, other shrubs that are on the boundaries of tree planting, some of which aren't actually part of the carbon package, but we provide anyway. And so those income streams are pretty easy to calculate. We've had some data in drought years now, so we can see what happens to a non-client farmer who doesn't have these trees. That's the most important, like, comparative control group. On MRV, we're registered with VERA on VM47 for agroforestry, and we've had multiple consultations. You know, the whole certification process will validate the MRV process. In the host government countries we operate in, it's a mixed bag. Most of the countries are actually developing pretty progressive voluntary carbon market rules for smallholder farmers. Some others are lagging, but on the whole, we're finding actually most of the governments in Africa are providing fairly decent kind of rules of engagement, and we have you have to enter into MOU and letters of kind of compliance processes with various agencies. So it takes, the one thing I would say is that it actually has been more expensive and more relationship building than we were expecting on the government relations side, but it's still really important. So we were happy to do it.
Super. We have a question from Huang Vo from our Climate Change Agriculture Food Security Program at University of Galway. Huang is asking, how can we design payment schemes so smallholder farmers directly benefit from carbon credits generated through intensive agroforestry? And are there independent third-party organizations that verify the methodology, carbon reductions, and payments in voluntary carbon markets? So kind of two questions really from Huang Vo.
Yeah, I mean, I think different certification bodies handle this differently. So someone like Plan Vivo has a mandatory 60% revenue share with smallholder farmers that they, as the verification body, certification body, will audit you for. And we also will be audited by Vera for all of our programs, including carbon payments. So the certification and audit process, to some extent, should be guaranteeing that farmers are paid what they say they will. On a macro level, like, how can we design payment schemes for carbon credits to actually go to farmers as much as possible? The fundamental problem is the price is too low. So if at the moment the floor price for an intensive agroforestry carbon program, I would argue, is ranging between $40 to $60 at a premium, and to really recognize the work that it takes if you were to put in all costs, and you're seeing averages much below that. I think the market will be able to guarantee better payments for farmers if if those prices go up and actually match the cost basis of producing them. And then secondly, if intermediaries would become more efficient and some of the processes became more efficient and less costly, then I would also argue that can help. Technologically, I think a lot of people would like to see more technology answers to this question, but I would argue price and efficiency are far more important than different technology plays at the moment. Ultimately, we're governed by the buyers. So if a buyer is going to buy into a verification body and a certification approach and a payment scheme that works at the right price point, then it gets better for farmers. And I would say the advocacy needs to happen there more than on the supply side.
Thanks, John. A question from Paul Wagstaff from Self-Help, taking the focus on Malawi, indicating that the government of Malawi has proposed to claim up to 40% of revenue from carbon sales. And how would this impact on your agroforestry business model?
Yeah, I've engaged multiple governments on this in the region, and this is a big problem in terms of the economics. Again, like it's okay actually if you get up to like $100 a ton, $150 a ton, that's okay. I think many of these governments are really struggling to find enough revenue from their own tax base, and I get why they see promise in the carbon markets. I would say that going back to my first statement, like no carbon credit is generated equally. If you were to take a RED Plus project that maybe had 100,000 hectares under management, and you have that one unit or 100,000 units, but you don't have 100,000 people to worry about or 100,000 smallholder farmers to worry about, some of these economics could work in the carbon markets. Like governments might be able to claim these kind of revenue shares in certain types of carbon markets. I don't think it would be healthy because they probably would find it hard to sell that carbon. But on the smallholder side, ultimately, the 40% of revenue, if you were to take that from the carbon at the moment, it would be unviable in the intensive agroforestry model. And then secondly, it would just be a tax on farmers if you're doing a high revenue share with them. So I think it's potentially very problematic.
Okay, so one last question. I'll just take the privilege of asking you one question myself, which is that, so like over the lifespan, let's say of a Phytoharbia tree, the carbon capture changes over time, and then you have the tree at its end of life, maybe 70 years down the line. And like, do the carbon credit systems take into account what happens that tree at the end of life? Is there a replacement intended? Or for instance, the reason I'm asking is we have colleagues in the university here, David Stiles and the Timber Technology Group, that look at the embodied carbon. So if you take timber and you put it into structures that then don't release that carbon to the atmosphere, for instance, displacing concrete, then there's a benefit to that. So that type of thinking.
Yes. Yeah, that's something. And in the tropics, the process is a lot quicker. So in terms of the content of carbon within tropical tree systems, if it gets used for house building, it has an increasing, a much quicker decay cycle. I'm clearly not a scientist, so that's my very layman's explanation. Yes, so we've looked into that. I mean, most of the carbon models do account for that, and obviously we're looking for a 100-year permanence threshold, although 30-year is kind of good enough for the voluntary carbon markets for smallholder farmer intensive agroforestry. I think we don't have enough research on the science of agroforestry systems in Africa in general. So we're relying on a ton of assumptions, some of which are well researched, some of which are not. Phytoharbia is probably better researched than other tree species, for example, in Rwanda that we work with. But I would say my last kind of, I guess, advocacy point is our abatement need is immediate and over the next 10, 20, 30 years. So I would actually argue in the carbon markets for a semi-permanent threshold and a permanent threshold. So I would argue for a 30-year permanence threshold that maybe has a lower value of carbon and a 100-year permanence threshold. Because if we were to incentivize us to sequester as much carbon as possible immediately, you should have various incentives within the carbon markets to do that. And I think at the moment having that one threshold is a bigger problem for us than the actual research of the tree species.
Thanks. That's a great point. So I think we'll give you a rest, John. Okay. So thanks for answering all of those questions and for the excellent presentation, which will be shared with everybody. So now we're going to move on to our other speakers. So like a virtual round of applause there for John. It's difficult on Zoom, but thanks very much, John. So now our next speaker I'm going to move to is Zachary Lager, who's the technical director of Eden People and Planet, based in Zambia, who work with communities to develop verified carbon projects and nature-based solutions for long-term value for people and planet, and really looking at blended finance and long-term commitments. Zachary has previously worked with a range of organizations across Africa, including Self-Help Africa and also Biocarbon. He's very committed to equitable, just, and effective approach to climate finance. So, Zachary, I'm going to hand over to you to give your perspectives on the questions and issues and opportunities relating to voluntary carbon markets. So, over to you.
Yeah, thanks. First and foremost, it's good to see so many familiar faces on this webinar. And John, yeah, I could say from firsthand experience that your projects here in Zambia are going really well. So congrats to the Acre team here in Zambia. You got a good team here. So first, I just wanted to give a really quick introduction. I think it would be much more valuable for us to jump into conversations and have some more dynamic conversations. So yeah, thanks for the introduction. Eden's approach to carbon is really taking a landscape level approach. So we're looking at large landscape level projects where we're combining REDD+ and ARR methodologies. So that's either agroforestry or kind of indigenous tree planting, and really integrating a land use management or a land use planning process into our approach. So not just focusing on restoration, not just focusing on smallholder needs, but looking at really large scale landscapes, and then integrating community-based planning and community-based land use planning processes. So trying to basically balance the conservation needs, biodiversity needs, with human needs, as well as economic needs. So Eden works in 4 kind of distinct landscapes. In Zambia, we're working in the Miombo landscapes. In Tanzania and Kenya, we're also working in Tanzania and Kenya. And then the 4th kind of priority country is Madagascar. Eden is a 501c3 in the US as well, but we've set up a carbon subsidiary to basically attract different forms of investment, everything from debt and equity investment to other forms of private sector investment. So really trying to balance philanthropic approaches with kind of more market-based approaches through our carbon subsidiary. So that's a quick introduction. Charles, I'm not sure if you want to jump right into the questions or if there's kind of specific questions you'd like me to
absolutely
kind of touch
on. We can move to the question Q&A kind of format with yourself, Zachary. Right? So, and I'll start off really with just open up questions. And again, if people have questions specifically for Zachary, then please pop them, or comments as well. It's fine. So first question really is like, how can carbon credits benefit smallholder farmers, and how can we ensure those benefits reach those smallholders and rural communities that are most impacted by climate change? This is kind of equity question, really.
I think John touched on a lot of this, but I'm going to kind of touch on this along with kind of the challenges. So there's kind of there's how they can benefit and what are the challenges to actually realizing those benefits. And I kind of see them as two different sides of the same coin. So first, where I would say kind of what makes carbon unique in terms of, I kind of look at 3 tiers of, in a sense, almost 3 tiers of benefits. First, you have the benefits, the really direct carbon benefits that come from implementation. So, in an agroforestry context, it's the tree packages that John was talking about. It's the, in some of our, for example, in Kenya, we're transitioning a payment for ecosystem services model directly to long-term payments and direct kind of cash payments to different farmers that are protecting and or rehabilitating land. So there's the kind of the direct benefits that come from carbon finance and implementation of the project. So those are almost kind of programmatic benefits. You then get a kind of a second tier of I don't want to say, in some senses even more important, which are the co-benefits that John also kind of hinted at. What is kind of the resilience that's coming from implementation? What's kind of what are the different kind of benefits that come from that implementation long term? And what I find, really, if we kind of separate the mechanism itself from kind of the uneven implementation of it, and a lot of there's a lot of criticisms that I actually quite agree with in the carbon space, but one of the things that I see is one of the biggest values is that we're talking now at 30 to 40 year timescales. And that allows us to look at benefits on different timescales as well. Yes, we need to reach those immediate benefits that come from implementation of projects, from your tree packages, from your increase in revenue from livelihoods activities. What are those direct immediate benefits? But the benefit of working on a carbon project is we're not looking at kind of 3 to 5 year time cycles anymore to achieve longer term, longer horizon benefits. So I would say kind of another tier, what are we trying to achieve in 30 years? What are we trying to achieve in 40 years? How are we building kind of capacities locally to ultimately reach what is kind of most important to me? And this is giving choices and autonomy to communities and to farmers. Really what we should be doing, some of this is my personal opinions, just as an asterisk here, but we've developed a lot of dependency cycles in the development work that we've been doing over the years. So how do we create more circularity, and how do we create more autonomy for communities to not be as dependent on development cycles, but to feel much greater autonomy and have more of a suite of options and more choices? And this is what I really see as the benefit of kind of this 30 to 40 year time horizon is we need to be thinking on both short-term cycles and how are we creating immediate benefits that come from projects, how are we creating immediate co-benefits, but then how are we also creating these longer-term cycles where we're driving empowerment and autonomy in our financial systems. If you want, I could touch on the challenges at the same time and kind of group those all two in one, if that makes sense, Charles.
Absolutely. Go ahead. Move into the challenges. Okay. Yeah, for sure.
So I would see a few of the main challenges I would say are kind of, they're interconnected. And I would completely agree with John that price and efficiency are two things that those are kind of the two biggest challenges. The way that I would kind of frame them is, one, there's what we call this valley of death in terms of seeking out funding for carbon finance, or at least what it's the money that you need to get from concept to implementation and flow of funds. And there's this time gap between when you develop a concept and then when you're actually starting to receive revenue from carbon credits. And this is where the vast majority of projects die. And it's also the biggest gap in terms of investment into funding. And so what does that mean? A lot of carbon project developers are left with this ethical dilemma. Well, do we invest a lot of money into kind of the free and prior informed consent process? Do we invest a lot of money in creating locally relevant governance structures? Do we invest a lot of money in kind of these key foundational co-design processes to get community commitment? That funding to get that is extremely difficult, and you're oftentimes left on the hook of paying that back. Whereas on the other hand, a lot of carbon project developers will think, well, how do I get fastest to issuance and verification? How do I get the fastest to getting money flowing to provide benefits to these two local communities? And it's kind of a really difficult choice because on the one hand, you shouldn't have to choose between those two things. You should be developing really strong FPIC processes where co-design is an essential element from the get-go, but private sector partners, public financing, grants, no one wants to fund that type of work. There's a lot of costs that go into it, and there's very little investment on that side of things. On the other hand, we need to start providing benefits to communities. And so a lot of project developers will rush to verification to get that flow of money. But then because there isn't a good co-design process, because there isn't, strong FPIC processes, there's breakdowns in kind of that foundation in the project. While getting to market more quickly, it's not built on a strong foundation. So I would say that's kind of one of the biggest challenges. Connected to that is overcommitment and market dynamics. To attract the investment, almost to a T, every project developer that I've worked with or been associated with overpromises what they can deliver. And that's to attract that initial investment. So then there's also this disequilibrium, this unevenness between the understanding from the supply side and the expectations from investors. So how do we start to bridge some of these gaps? How do we start to have more honest conversations about what's actually feasible? And how do we actually get to a price point that's reflective of all of that? I would say those are kind of the biggest challenges to being able to follow through on a lot of the benefits.
Super. Yeah, I'm going to ask you two more questions right from the chat, and then we'll move on to the next speaker. Okay, Zachary.
Perfect.
So Una Murray is asking, what mechanisms do you use to ensure that women farmers who are often less connected to formal networks know about and benefit equitably from these opportunities? It's kind of gender and social inclusion question.
Yeah, no, it's essential. So all of like all of Eden's projects are based on the CCB standards, climate, community, and biodiversity. And a critical pillar of that is gender and vulnerable groups. So whenever we're designing our kind of FPIC rollout processes, we ensure that we're engaging with local women's groups. Like in Kenya, a lot of the land tenure processes as well have excluded women in some cases. So making sure that, like in Kenya, we're creating a cooperative governance structure, cooperative societies where men and women have equal votes in decisions. We're engaging specifically with women's groups aside to community meetings where men's voices tend to be dominated. We also are trying to ensure that there's a certain number of leadership positions and governance positions that are for women. So it needs to be culturally appropriate in different contexts, but it's an absolutely essential component of our verification and our audit processes, is not only to our project design as well.
Super. And then last question from the chat, and there are additional questions here I realize that have not been relayed, but maybe Zachary, if you have the time, you could maybe respond to any that you think you can, right? So, but this is from Orla Kilcullen and Department of Foreign Affairs, asking how willing are off-takers to lock into contracts that ensure project costs are covered, given the volatility in the market. The price John quoted for the floor is far above what I can see as the current price per credit.
Hi, Orla. Good to see you again as well, and thanks for the question. How willing are off-takers to lock into contracts? Not very willing. The challenge, we're getting closer there, but there's still a lot of challenges on the demand side of things. What we're seeing a lot more of is kind of price floor and price ceilings. So locking in minimum payments, but also limiting the amount of how high that price can go as well. I think the biggest question is that the floor that buyers expect and the floor that the supply side expects, they're not really aligned. And so, I'm very much in agreement with John as well. We need to find ways to ensure a higher price floor. And right now, like financial and off-taker discussions are about trying to find the cheapest possible way to implement a project. And we all know here, whether it's carbon or whether it's traditional development work, driving prices down and pushing prices down for as cheap a unit cost as possible does not give a strong foundation to a project. So are there some buyers that are starting to come along and some buyers that are willing to start kind of recognizing the additional value that comes from a carbon project, the biodiversity and the community benefits? Yes, but the conversation needs to advance much more for project pricing to make sense. So there are some willing buyers, but I would not say that willingness is a market-wide trend.
Super. Thanks so much, Zachary. And I think we're gonna in the interest of time, we're gonna move on to the next speaker. So again, a round of applause for Zach, and we're gonna move on to VITA. VITA is an NGO member organization of the Irish Forum for International Agricultural Development. And John Weakliam, who's the CEO of VITA, is going to give a presentation on VITA's experience with with carbon credits in the voluntary carbon credit market. And VITA works primarily in Eritrea and Ethiopia for many years on food, forestry, water, and clean energy. But John will explain that. So I'm going to hand over to John.
Charles. I won't do a presentation in the time available. I'll just get ready for Q&A. But briefly, we started this business 20 odd years ago, and it's been a labor of love. It's a very troublesome topic, carbon generally, and it requires an awful lot of patience and long-term thinking and good luck to take it somewhere. We started 9 years ago with a fund, a 2 million fund, which we designed as a blended finance model, grants a third, 2/3 investment for basically to reach 200,000 people with cook stoves and water in Ethiopia and Eritrea. The accreditation process, one of the questions, Charles, I saw that you put, that you were going to ask, the accreditation. And the accreditation is really the main barrier to entry. You need really strong partners. In our case, CO2 Balance in the UK were very good. I hear others mentioned who have been very difficult. But without funding for the accreditation, which generally would need to be a grant, it's very difficult for a small NGO or even a larger one to make an investment to get projects up on gold standard or VERA. You need a couple of 100,000 just to get started, but you need a lot more to get a project up and running at a scale that works. We were lucky to get EU funding in 2012, all those years ago, to learn and get ourselves up on gold standard. So when we did start in 2016, we had learned a lot and we lent heavily on our accreditation partners. We completed that project 3 years ago. We repaid our investors with a small interest payment. And we're now, if you look at the slide that's been shared, we're on the second stage, which is it's at the moment about a 10 million euro project to provide clean cook stoves, water, and trees to 1.3 million people. Again, the accreditation is a war zone because of various reasons, one just being the cost itself of doing baselines and kitchen tests and proposal documents. It needs expertise that no NGO would even want to have, I dare say. Gold Standard keep moving the bar. They reduced the number of credits. They were over issuing credits, for example, that come from safe water. Water is a subject we don't have time to discuss, but you can get carbon credits from providing safe water. There's a new thing called FNRB, which has halved the number of credits in midstream. So you start a project, you think you'll have X credits, then you suddenly only have half of those credits. And as a result, it's between the problems of accrediting projects and getting issued credits to the market and the market prices by themselves, which as has been discussed by Zach and others, the market itself is still struggling to pay a decent price. So as a business model, it's not working for now. As an opportunity to give benefits back to communities beyond the service, beyond the cook stove, the tree or the water, it's still not working. We're going to depend on Article 6 unfolding sooner rather than later, and hopefully before 2029, whereby unit prices will go higher and the potential to share the carbon revenue with communities and some share for government will become possible. So in the short term, looking at the other question asked, Charles, that you sent around, the benefit to community. Well, firstly, as Zach said, it's can the household have a stove that can be sustained over time? Can they have access to water? Can they benefit from good trees, useful trees? Maybe so. The second layer of benefit will depend on carbon markets. We've designed a carbon dividend, a community dividend, but that will depend on the price that you can obtain from the markets. At the moment, there isn't that potential. And the third aspect would be in a circular investment model, such as you see on the screen there, where we repay the investors, the surplus from that will all flow back to new people, new communities to get new benefits. So there are different layers of benefit, hugely dependent on carbon markets. I think enough said, given the time available probably. So Charles, if you want to take some questions and I can answer.
Yeah. Absolutely, yeah. So there's a question here from Patricia in self-help, which I think relates to kind of the kind of longer term perspectives piece that I think you raised as well, John. So I wonder where we are in the carbon space life cycle, initial frontier approach, and now more pushback from national governments. Can we expect better cooperation and regulation? So your kind of perspectives, I guess, on that question, John, if that's possible.
It's strengthening exponentially. For example, Ethiopia, where we work, the government has drawn up, well, firstly, they have a forestry proclamation to govern carbon finance in relation to forestry. They're designing a national carbon law. They have almost completed a national carbon finance strategy. So the government cooperation is growing. We got an LOA from the Ethiopian government, which is a kind of government endorsement for our cook stoves program. So the level of cooperation, the signs are very promising, but it's very much dependent from Eritrea. There's not a hope in hell of getting some progress on that front. I think that Article 6 will provide a permanent framework or let's say a 10-year framework at least. The focus is much more on carbon removal than avoidance. So projects with high benefits like stoves and water, there's probably only a 10-year horizon at the moment envisaged where there will be the potential for decent revenues to be generated to be able to give benefits back to community. So it's a work in progress, but I think overall I'd be pretty optimistic that Article 6 will be very good for this sector. There will be huge potential for larger projects. The timing of it will be somewhere between now and 2029 and difficult to predict.
Excellent. Okay. And so a kind of positive perspective on Article 6 and how that unfolds. So one question, how are, like in your experience or VITA's experience, how are the communities experiencing the benefits from VITA's voluntary carbon market offsetting program, the types of benefits, I guess, the communities experience, the beneficiaries?
But this is where NGOs can have such a bigger space here and unfortunately don't have that. So you're looking at the commercial project developers dominating the horizon unduly, I would say, because we are in the business of providing benefits. We cannot get involved in carbon finance except in a community-centric manner that is literally through the whole cycle that the community should be paramount, whether that's participating in design, implementation, or the proceeds. And I think that the key for Cook Stoves project is huge demand. We're seeing 90% take up. You know, every rural household wants a better stove, and it's a matter of designing community-led processes to make that happen. Water doesn't need explanation. Trees, the Ethiopian government very strong on trees, so there's a green legacy program. So every household recognizes the value of trees, both environmentally and in terms of co-benefits, etc. So I think the key is that for any project to be designed in and around communities in the way that an NGO would be expected to do so, and in a way that would give us a comparative advantage over commercial operators who just want to generate carbon the fastest, cheapest way possible. And I think we've missed a trick in our sector. I don't think it's too late, but I would encourage any NGO on this webinar to give it a very good look and try to find some way of overcoming the barrier to entry, because I think at the very least it deserves a certain investment, which will only come to fruition with Article 6. But I think the Paddy Power would say the odds are on carbon, I'd say.
Okay. And so Paul Wagstaff has a question for you, John. That have the governments of either Ethiopia or Eritrea proposed to tax carbon credits?
Well, leaving Eritrea out, not a conversation really. Ethiopia is looking at benefit sharing. They're looking at a 20%, I would suspect. It's 20% share, 15% local government, 5% national government for forestry carbon. For stoves and water, they haven't said. We're waiting for the carbon finance strategy. I suspect it'll be similar. Their driver is not fiscal income. Their driver is development benefits, which is a really helpful starting point.
Excellent. Okay. And then last question then from Orla, Kilcullen, Department of Foreign Affairs. You did say, John, that you were able to repay investors with a small profit. Are you saying that would be no longer be repeatable with the current criteria for credit generation? It's just a point of
Yeah,
clarification.
yeah, it will depend all on the market price, but the way we've designed it, we've borrowed money at a 6% interest, so we need to repay investors in a 5-year horizon. And according to the current market price, assuming we could get Article 6 letters of authorization, we'll just about repay our investors. The challenge is to get to surplus to be able to pay community dividends and reinvest. But for now, the whole project we've set up, it's been designed by Arthur Cox as a legal entity with a fund manager. So we do have to follow all the rigors of commercial operations as VITA to make the whole thing a success.
Super. Thanks, John. So, and thanks, John, for the perspectives of VITA and the great work of VITA in this space and pioneering work in many respects. And so, thanks again to John. And then we've got one more speaker. I realize we're running over time, but we'll keep going. So, I'm going to introduce Mathieu Metois, who's the Global WASH Technical Officer at Self-Help Africa. He's a specialist in water, hygiene, and sanitation for rural development. Prior to Self-Help, he's worked with Interaid and Action Contre la Femme, ACF, and Solidarités International in DRC, Congo, and Haiti. So over to Mathieu, if you want to share your slides, and then go right ahead. And Zachary has to leave us, so thanks again to Zachary for the intervention, and we will follow up with Zachary and try and weave him back to connect with others here as well. Okay, thanks. Over to you, Mathieu.
Hi, thanks, Charles. So you said it all. Can you see my screen right now?
You can see your screen fine, yeah.
Okay, perfect. So yeah, I will try to be quick and answer the question we agreed before. So thanks for the introduction, first of all. And I just wanted to say that maybe Self-Help Africa is known from everybody in this call, but just reminding that we are working on agriculture, agroforestry, enterprise, and also integrated water resource management. So as you said, I'm in charge of advising on water sanitation and hygiene, and specifically on sustainable access to water, the reason why we are working on carbon, also on water. And to complement the previous presentation of John from VITA, why carbon credit and water? Because we are using the gold standard approach and the gold standard methodology, and there's a principle of surprise demand. So meaning that if communities have constant access to safe water, we are avoiding the emission that would be emitted if people have to boil water to ensure, because boiling will be the only solution for them to make sure that the water is safe. Carbon for water is very interesting because the problem of functionality is quite important in sub-Saharan Africa. Almost only around 60% of water facilities are functional, and there is limited funding or project looking at maintenance or are looking at what is happening after. There is a lot of funding for new construction, but otherwise it all relies on communities, and it's proven that it's not working. And where you have a carbon project, which is a cycle of carbon project is 5 years and can be renewed twice. So at the end, you can have fundings for 15 years. And SHA, we are it's for us a good opportunity. I will take the example of Malawi, where we are working since 2013. And we have been able to develop local services for professional maintenance, and meaning that local technicians are coming every quarter to visit the water point under our portfolio, and making sure that they are functional and doing the repairs and doing preventive maintenance. And we are using also this project to strengthen local institutions to be able to monitor the performance of the service providers, but also for them to have a better understanding of what is the solution, the condition of access to water in their area, just wanted also to explain how does it work concretely. Gold standard are very high standard, and we have stringent criteria. We need to look at, of course, functionality, but we need to ensure that the water points are not done for more than 38 hours. We need to do regular water quality testing, regular surveys on consumption and usage. So it is costly and it takes a bit of time, which maybe could be seen as a downtime of such project, because a lot of the revenues are reinjected into the project management and project implementation itself. On the other hand, the very stringent criteria from gold standard have helped us to evolve our approach and methodology. We were talking earlier of MRV tech. We are probably not there yet, but at least we are working with both service providers to use their smartphone to report on the functionality of the water point, and which feed our monitoring to gold standard. And which is a great progress to be able to see almost live what is the condition of the water points. We are testing also some sensors, not to say that it's working perfectly, but sensors that could, for example, in this photo that I'm displaying, install an hand pump, and we can tell us when the volume that are produced by the hand pump, but also when it's breaking down. But again, not working perfectly so far. But it has also forced us to move a bit from only hand pump, but look also at converting those hand pump to install a submersible pump that will be generated by solar energy, and then having pipe schemes. So it's interesting because we are providing water closer to the home, and in that regard, we are installing also smart meters to be able to follow the consumption, and again to be able to follow if there are any breakdowns. And it's having pipe schemes also allow us to install inline chlorinators that ensure that water quality is okay until the final users. So a lot of complexity, but also force us to evolve our approaches. But it's also a downside because we are a bit we don't want to exclude communities who are relying on hand pump, and they will be still relying on hand pump for a long time. And we were talking about also earlier, sorry, of the reinvestment process. So we have been reinvesting the projects into new construction, and we are in Malawi. Have released a carbon framework recently, and we will be discussing about how the percentage that will be reallocated to the government. But the fact that we have been doing new construction, we are hoping that we can have agreement with the government on decision on how to prioritize which communities we could serve more. And we are looking also at capacitating the capacities of the service providers, and we have been using carbon as a performance-based incentives, and these are the options that we are considering for the future. But one of the challenge of carbon is that we need scale, and we need to do more water points, which mean more upfront costs. And so it's an interesting discussion to have with other partners on how to scale and how to aggregate our carbon credit, because it's also one of the challenges in the time to sell those carbon. And we were talking earlier about $40 to $60 per ton for water carbon project. We are more around the 4 to 12 USD per water point. So briefly, that's this on my side.
That's really great, Mathieu. So I'm just watching our time here, but I have one question maybe for clarification. So the self-help activities on carbon and water, what's the main source of the carbon credits from the water activities? Is it predominantly about purification of water, or does it extend to wastewater treatment or irrigation? Like where the carbon, what's the source of the carbon credits that are being generated?
So there are different. Purification is one. Maintaining the water point is also another one. But generally speaking, if we look at the wash sector, water sanitation, there are also opportunity related to sanitation, reducing waste and reducing emission of methane. Biogas is part of it, but also alternatives looking at reducing waste, and compost is also eligible for carbon. So there is And there is also new methodology under development or on development on WASH.
Okay, understood. And Huang Vo has a question, I think, which is kind of related maybe to what I was asking, is how much greenhouse gas emissions are reduced as a result of implementing water-related projects? Is there like ballpark estimates of what can be achieved or anything like that?
I will say that for around 100 water points, you will reduce 10,000 tons of carbon dioxide.
Okay. And I think we've
But it depends, of course, a lot of the context and different countries, yes.
Understood, yeah. A lot of variability and difference. And so I think we'll stop with the question from Mathieu there, because we want to wrap up really with getting perspectives from others who are in the audience and other organizations. And so firstly, let's say like a virtual hand clap for Mathieu. Thank you so much for taking the time and highlighting or indicating the work of SHA that relates the intersection of water and carbon. So now really we're going to wrap up in the next 2 or 3 minutes or 5 minutes or so. So we have Dee from Trocra who's making an important point here. Dee, do you want to speak the point, or do you want me to read out the point? Because I think we can unmute your mic and then maybe you can make the point, if that would be okay. I don't know, Patrice, if that's possible to do, or maybe Dee.
Can you hear me?
Yeah, Dee, you're on.
Okay.
Yeah, you got the floor. Okay, go ahead.
No, it's just, I mean, I know you wanted to have Fionn on here to speak from a kind of rights perspective, but any of these spaces that I've been in recently are very much coming from those already in the carbon market space. And I just think we need to open it up to have that broader discussion, because they're already invested. And, I'm speaking at Trocra, we are still exploring and looking at this. There's quite divergent views on this, which I think is important, because I think it's really important that we have those divergent views and come together to debate it and really understand it before we run ahead with. I mean, we know it's happening, but the other concern I have is how this is being promoted as such a big solution. And we know that the IPC have said, yes, it's part, but if you look at any of that graphs or any of that data, it should be a small part of that solution. And so I just am concerned of the distraction and focus that is happening on carbon markets in this. So yeah, I just wanted to say that. And as I say, Trocra don't have a position on this yet, so that's why I put that's a personal opinion.
Dee, thanks for that. And I guess I'll ask if any of the speakers want to comment on that. And I guess that one of the main points being made here is that the scale of the climate challenge, requires like massive mitigation emissions cuts essentially to 2030, 2050 and beyond, and then negative emissions technologies, changes in lifestyle across all sector and economics and so forth. And clearly voluntary carbon markets will play a role in that. And I suppose one question I had was, is there any risk that they may displace other activities or be overestimated in terms of their impact, which is somewhat related to Dee's question, I think also. So I don't know whether any, and it's difficult, I think, if you're in the space, you can't be saying, okay, there are limitations to this, because that doesn't help in terms of financing. So it's a double-edged sword. I can understand it a little. John, do you want to take that?
Yeah, I can. Well, this John, right?
Yeah, you're John. Yeah. Sorry.
Thanks.
Sorry.
I mean, it's hard for us sometimes, because when you're in the weeds of trying to get a project financed, it's hard to see the wood for the trees, for want of a better expression, in this market. One of the problems is we're all so insufficiently funded for this work, and so we're all just desperate to find new ways of financing climate resilience work, adaptation, regenerative agriculture, and there aren't many good alternatives at the moment apart from philanthropy, which is diminishing, and the carbon markets we've tried to invest in. I would say that we're going to serve 10 million farmers hopefully by 2030. We're currently serving 5 million. Of that, we can only reach 200,000 with the carbon markets at the moment, because it's so complicated, and the barriers we see in terms of access are so high that even with a huge amount of time and commitment and investment, we're not really going to see them scale to that many farmers. And so I think what you're talking about is a much bigger lens and a macro global issue. And I think you're right in advocating for a wider aperture to the topic. But on the other hand, we're not even going to hit that. We're not going to be able to hit our own goals because of how challenging the market is anyway.
Thanks, John. I think on that note, I think we'll finish up, because I think we've had a pretty good kind of overview of the mechanics, the rationale for the voluntary carbon markets, the mechanisms that different NGOs and organizations are using, then the pros and cons, the challenges, which are often quite detailed. But as IFIAD, one of our roles is to kind of convene and broker communication, I guess, between different groups that are working in the same space. So I've been talking to Patrice, and we'd like to try and continue this dialogue beyond this webinar by establishing a working group on this. So if anybody wants to be part of that, we're happy to convene that to kind of share kind of good practices, think about innovations. There was a whole list of stuff about research gaps and so forth, which may be of interest to research people and so forth. And I think if anybody wants to follow this discussion further or bring others into it, we're happy to try and convene a working group to continue this forward, and may help basically to help the organizations as we move forward as to how to navigate this. So at that, I think we'd invite you to get in touch with Patrice and myself in relation to that. And I'd like to thank everybody and all the speakers and all the participants. I realize we've run over time, but it's been very detailed and very engaging. And great to get the diversity of views. And thanks, Steve, for the communication at the end as well. So thanks everybody, and have a lovely day.